Like we sort of are settling in on a mission to impact a million leaders. So that might be through my writing, through our management playbook, through the course. Arguably, sometimes when people come to when CEOs come to the course, we're not just impacting them, but if they implement the types of things we talked about, we're implementing their teams. We're impacting their teams. And so we have that North Star.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook Podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today we have with us Dave Kline, who after decades leading high-impact teams across financial services and consulting, decided to head out on his own with his wife to found the Management Accelerator. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
So you've got a really interesting background, and obviously you worked so long in the corporate world where you were very successful, worked for some of the biggest companies in the world. What made you then decide to take the leap and go and build your own thing?
Well, I think the origins, like a lot of great stories, will track back to your childhood, right? And the influences that your parents have. And so I grew up with a dad who was a serial entrepreneur. And, or even probably the more accurate description for a lot of those was, he was a hustler. He was selling supplements before it was cool. He was helping put on events. We had a kiln in our basement for putting decals on mugs. And, a lot of these sort of started and stopped. And I'd say really none of them took off. He had a nursing degree. He would constantly fall back on in between these ventures, going back to nursing, making some money, and then trying again. He eventually caught on with one. He sort of got ahead of the home healthcare trend that was happening with people bringing nurses in home so they didn't have to go to hospitals and things of that nature, and grew a pretty successful 7-figure business. And so I got to be sort of front row for all of that. And despite my dad and I being very different, I feel like that those seeds were planted extremely early, and then I thought, great, well, I'll go to school. I'll get my degree. I'll be one of the first, with an undergraduate degree. I'll go work for a couple of years, and that'll give me what it takes to go run my own business. I always sort of wanted to have my own thing. And 2 years consulting turned into 10 years at Moody's, turned into another 10 years at Bridgewater. And all of a sudden I was looking up at a quarter century of working in corporate America and sort of asked, if not now, when? My kids aren't getting any younger. The tuition bills coming in, 6 or 8 years for college aren't getting any smaller. And so if we're going to, make the most of this one precious life, now's the time.
And I guess seeing that example as a kid growing up where your dad had tried and failed so many times, what did that do to you? Because obviously you saw he was successful in the end, but you also were very then aware of all of the failures and how maybe you might have the same problem of you started a business and it failed multiple times before you were able to then latch onto the good thing.
Well, I think there's probably 2 or 3 things that influenced me with that whole thing. So there's one which I didn't talk about, which is, my parents split up when I was relatively young. And so at 11 years old, I became the man of the house. And so there was this, I felt like this weight and this burden to, that sort of led to a scarcity mentality. I was very nervous about would we have enough money, and so that sort of influenced a lot of those early career decisions. And so that would probably be the negative side to it. I do think that partly what led to the 2 years becoming 25 years was partially that. I don't know, and another piece would be as a know-it-all 13-year-old, I sort of thought, well, if I he didn't have a degree and he didn't study business. So if I went to go do those things, then I could go get in there and not make the mistakes he made. And I think, that was, again, sort of driving some of the engine behind that. But now, in the seat, right? We could talk a little bit about the businesses in a minute of what we've been building, what we're learning, where we're failing, where we're making mistakes. I feel like I'm getting to carry forth that resiliency. Right. I can sort of draw upon that and be no, he kept trying, and that experimentation, that continual improvement, that compounding, and one thing that I think is a reaction that I'm trying to do differently than he did is I think he gave up on some of the ideas too early, that he didn't show up consistently enough. He didn't push through the dip. And that's sort of driving us, we've been a little bit fortunate with some pieces taking off relatively quickly, but that idea of, we're not building the business that's going to be successful a year from now. It's the one that, we can rely on 10 years from now, and can we show up every day? Are we doing something that brings us such fulfillment that we have no problem doing that for a decade?
So the business at the moment is focused around leadership and training, right? But where did that come from? So obviously you were doing that at Bridgewater and at the different companies. But why did you focus on it even when you were there yourself? Before you even thought about becoming an entrepreneur, what took you down that path within the corporate world?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to tell you that it was a perfectly strategic decision. I left Bridgewater, jumped right into management training, and it's been nothing but success. But it's actually been probably like a looser sketch and 4 or 5 serendipitous moments. So just to rewind quickly, I left Bridgewater at the end of 2020. And we set out, probably breakthrough number 1 for us was we were going to buy a business instead of build a business. Like partially the story I had told myself for those 20 plus years was we would do it once we had the great idea. Like once we had that one magical breakthrough, world changing aha moment, then we'd dive in. And, part of what I learned in that career is like ideas are cheap and execution is what gets you paid. And so it was really unlocking to move from, I must come up with the best business idea, to saying, actually, I'm pretty good at taking something that's a loose sketch and turning it into a well-operating business. And so let me instead go buy something that's in decent shape and see if I can run the heck out of it and end up with a profitable, growing, thriving business. And so we left, we looked at businesses of all shapes and sizes, physical, digital, got very close on an oil change franchise. I'm very grateful given the EV trend. We walked away from that one. But we settled on a education review site that we bought online. So as a digital asset, it was really a website with a lot of great content, good partnerships, and we dove in. And, it's a nerve-wracking moment. Like despite having led a team that ran a $300 million website back at Moody's, when the team is just you and you've got to learn SEO, you've got to learn affiliate marketing, you've got to learn email marketing. When the site goes down, you've got to figure out why. Like that was sort of like day one of like, oh, wow, being an entrepreneur without a team it's a very new adventure. So that got us into the game. And then what then happened next as part of the thesis behind buying that business was this growing trend of cohort-based courses. Companies like Maven and Reforge and Section 4 are sort of taking the best of both worlds, right? The online courses like Skillshare and LinkedIn Learning, but they're teaching them live. They're bringing together groups of people who all have a common interest and sort of putting those two pieces together. And we thought, hey, we could start reviewing those. And that would be a growth part of the business we bought. And then reality dose number 2 sets in 2 months into the business, and Google changes the algorithm, and half of our, 30-40% of our traffic drops in a day. And in a moment of freak out, I was like, wow, I've got to get into social media. Like that seemed, I got to diversify this traffic. I've been lurking on places like Twitter and LinkedIn for years. Apparently we're going to have to go learn how to do this. And so I put that cohort-based world together with social media and said, let me take Saul Hill Bloom's audience building class. Let me understand how I can build this brand in a way that drives traffic and sort of save my newly purchased asset. Long story short, 5 minutes into that, he says something to the effect of, if you're here to build a brand account, you're in the wrong place. People want to learn from humans. And so you're going to have to start writing under your smiling face, under your real name. And I thought, what the heck am I going to write about? So experimented with a lot. Management, leadership seemed to be the topics that really resonated for people, like slightly different perspectives, very tactical. And that then led quickly to working with the Maven team to build a course. We went from hoping we'd have 10 people in the first one to being oversubscribed by like 150. We've now taught, we're on cohort 10. We've done them, publicly with people from 5 continents. We've done them privately at companies. And that business, which was meant to be a bit of an add-on to the one we bought, is now the bigger business than the one, we purchased a year ago. So it's been a fun journey.
So you mentioned a few interesting things there. I'm going to come back to some of them as well. But you mentioned about we a few times there, and your business partner is obviously your wife. So how did that come about? Did you both plan to do this together? Was it just a coincidence that you're both looking to start a new project at the same time? And how do you split up your skills as well, and who does what?
It's a great question. So we, if you're familiar with Justin Welsh on social media, he talks a lot about the solopreneur. And we have sort of always thought about the idea of being the duopreneurs, right? The idea that, we have one of those relationships where either of us would come home from work. Like she worked at Goldman Sachs, she worked at Google. We were always happy to talk about work and brainstorm and try to, nudge each other's careers. It wasn't a taboo topic. And so when we had thought about owning our own business, we did think we would do it together. The exact who does what and what's the shape of that, it's fluid and continues to evolve, and we're trying to figure it out. Because we have goals that are as much business related as personal related. And just in the way that we have to publish a new edition of our management playbook tomorrow, we also have to get somebody to soccer practice. And so, the who does what when is something we keep evolving on. But it's been incredibly fun. And I think we have one of those relationships. She and I grew up in that same small town I was talking about a little bit ago. So I've known her, 70% of our respective lives. And so there's a pretty good mind meld going on there.
Yeah. So I guess you're not worried about anything coming out now, like, oh, they're terrible at work for these traits. You've kind of seen every bit of that. So you know exactly how each other think in the work environment as well. I think that's something sometimes...
She already all I'm terrible to work with.
And what's the things that you split up, or what's your priorities versus her priorities? Or maybe the best thing is, what's the skills that she's better at than you are?
It's a long list. I would say very practically, I'm drawing upon, leading teams for 20 plus years, Mar led teams for probably a decade. So it's not that she doesn't share some of that. I just probably did it longer and at a bigger scale. Her background was much more sales, business development, and things of that nature. And so I think really the natural dividing line right now is, how is she helping to grow the business, find the new clients? She has this uncanny ability to connect with people. Like, she's one of those people that you talk to her for 10 minutes and you're like, oh, like, we're best friends. Which is, I might have many other strengths. You wouldn't necessarily say the same is true of me, right? And so I think she's very much that. She can be the face. She does the business development. She finds the new clients. So she's sort of focused on that side of the business. And then a lot of, for me, has been the teaching, the coaching, the systems and frameworks that we are building out to help people manage more effectively, to lead with more intention.
Yeah, I thought I'd just ask you that question, is that when your wife watches this, you get in the good books? Thought I'd set you up for that. So you said about you started on Twitter, right? And one of the interesting things is that you started on Twitter almost in a panic, right? Because of the website you bought failing, and you just made this big move of, okay, we're going to go into our own business. The first thing you buy, it was going well, and then 3 months in, things tank. How was that emotional state? You said how you knew from your dad and things before where there was going to be iterations, right? It wasn't going to be perfect first time. But then when it actually hits you, it's a different thing. How did that feel?
I'd say I was honestly of two minds. So I tend to be exceptionally clear-eyed, rational, and calm. Like, if you ask people about my superpowers, like, those would show up. And so to some degree, there was a probability the site was going to go up, and there was a probability it was going to go down. And this was just one of those probabilities playing out. So on one hand, I could very much kind of put the lens on and just say, okay, so what has happened? What is driving that? And what do we do about it? There was this other voice on my shoulder that was like, what have you gotten yourself into? There's this moment of, imposter syndrome is real. I stepped into, could I run a business in the generic? I think so, but could I run a business in the specific, this specific business with these technical requirements, with, the black box that is Google, and trying to keep up with them and outrun other people who are trying to do the same thing, while learning email marketing and social media. I don't know, there was a lot of moments of was this a step too far? Was this a little bit too much? Did we bite the wrong apple? So it was funny. It was sort of and I would swing from one to the other multiple times a day.
you said like those early days, because obviously if you're not used to that as well, how did it feel in terms of growing that Twitter audience quickly? Because I obviously know for myself where when I started writing online, things started going well and I started getting viral straight away. You start to almost believe your own hype, right? And that was a bit at the beginning. It's like, okay, I'm amazing. Everything I do is so good. And then I had the bit of a fallow period. But how did you kind of measure that? How did you ride that wave in a way that you still obviously knew that, okay, we need to make this into a business and it can't just be me being a Twitter celebrity?
It's a good question. Like we'll talk about this in our course a lot, which is for, oftentimes you sort of have to help people's self-perception catch up to the reality. Like sometimes they're the last one to notice. And so I felt like that might've been the case here a little bit. Like as someone who I like lurked on social media for 10 years. I never liked, I never posted, I never commented, like literally nothing. And then all of a sudden to go from that to, building a network and commenting on people's work and writing my own unique work every day. It sort of took a while. Like it was probably 30 to 50,000 followers before I was like, oh wait, like there's people who actually want to learn from you. Mars is my wife, is this visual learner. And I think she said it to me one day. We got to like, we had just gotten to like just shy of 20,000 followers on Twitter. And she said, you're now writing for Madison Square Garden. Like MSG is following you now, and then that's become Giant Stadium, and then that's become the big house in Ann Arbor. And you're like, wow, when you see that picture and you're like, holy cow, like there's people who have like raised their hand at that scale to learn, wherever it is I'm on my journey, what I can share to help them go, be a little more efficient, a little bit happier, a little more engaged on theirs. Like it's pretty surreal. I feel like it's still catching up. And then the only real way that we've turned that into a business is, it started mostly inbound. It started people approaching us and saying like, hey, I read this thing that you wrote. Do you coach? Do you teach? Is there a way I could get involved? And that sort of lined up with creating the course with Maven, and so other than people putting their name on a list and saying, please let me know about the next course. All the companies we've worked with have come to us. All the folks have signed up, have found us through Twitter and LinkedIn. So we're not, we don't have a massive monetization strategy. It's sort of keep putting these ideas into the world. And when they find the right people at the right time, then they might want to come and go deeper with us.
So with the Maven course itself, so obviously you mentioned a few different companies that you were reviewing beforehand. What made you go with Maven? And I've interviewed Wes in the past as well, so obviously I know she's lovely. But what was it behind that decision of like, we're going to create a course on this platform?
I would say one was circumstantial and one was very intentional. So the circumstantial piece was, of all the founders of those areas, because we were sort of tracking them because of the business we bought, they were the most active on Twitter. So like you were just hearing a lot of Maven. I think Sahil Bloom was actually either an investor or an early instructor on there. And so it was just hearing they were building in public, seeing what they're doing. Our site also reviews Udemy, which Goggin, one of the other founders, helped create. Wes had created the Alt MBA with Seth Godin, who's one of my favorite authors. So there was just enough of like, wow, there's a lot of credibility built into this thing. The intentional piece, though, was I felt like we were catching them at the right moment. That there's some strategy to attaching yourself to something right before it takes off, and so they had sort of their V1 of instructors. A lot of them aren't necessarily people who want to do this for a living. They were sort of doing it as a side hustle. Their platform was getting more mature. The awareness of CBCs was growing up. And so it just felt like, wow, I think we're coming in right at it's probably going to make it. And you can be considered one of the early instructors on the platform. So that was actually pretty intentional and it worked out really well. We're one of the top selling courses on there. With that combination of like high ratings and high attendance. So that part worked.
And what do you do to maintain those high ratings? Because obviously is one thing if the actual sales part, right? Getting people onto the course. But once they're on there, what do you think makes people want to come back for more or people really enjoy your courses? What strategies do you use there?
So one of the like the foundational tenets of the course is this idea of continual improvement, right? Like if you're going to lead a team, you're going to want to have a picture of what good looks like. You're going to want to compare that to where you are. You're going to want to find the biggest problems, solve them, and keep doing that over and over and over. And so one of the tactics we try to use in the course is to show versus tell, right? So I don't want to just give you frameworks and tell you what to do. I want to show you me living those principles, me applying those own systems. And so even in our second module, where it's all about giving feedback to the people, one of the exercises we have them do is to give feedback to us. So it creates this great loop, right? Like we've learned that early cohorts were too short. So we went from 60 minutes to 90 minutes. We've experimented with new modules, and then we had them rate them. And the two that we kept two of them that were the highest rated overall. I started surprising people with coaching in the early cohorts, and the adoption rates were low. I started marketing the coaching as part of the course, and the adoption rates were high, and the scores went up because we were unlocking their biggest challenge. And so I'd say like the single biggest thing we're doing is we use all of these leaders to tell us how to make it even better, how to like dial it up even more. One that like is also counterintuitive. If you're familiar with Alex Hormozy and $100 million offers, like speaking of on social media, he and his wife Layla are pretty much everywhere. But his book is honestly one of the most nutrient dense business books I've read in a long time. And I had this instinct that he confirmed in the book, and I was pretty unnerved when I did it. But like when we did our very first cohorts, we were like $700. Right. We were just like, will anyone come? Will anyone pay us? And he was like, raise your prices. It will select higher quality students or customers. The only ones will come to you will be more deeply aligned. And because they have more skin in the game, they'll get more out of it. And so we experimented. We did that. And the scores from, when we changed the price from being $750 to over $2,000, like went up massively. So like, which was just interesting because it really did attract like an exceptionally high caliber of leader. I think because they and their companies were paying more money, like they felt really invested. So like they were just bringing, like they came to every class. They came with their questions. They came willing to help other people. And like all of a sudden, even though we weren't doing anything very dramatically different, what we had attracted through that magnet had raised the quality for everybody. And so it was just this beautiful flywheel. So that was the one that was like, if you said, what was surprising to you? That was probably the biggest surprise, because in the one course, when we actually made the switch, we didn't change many of the other things like I described. So that was a pretty well-controlled variable. And the scores went up notably.
And you mentioned before about like, imposter syndrome in a way, but that's, I think, something that stops a lot of people from implementing those kind of tactics. So if they're worried that, oh, can I charge this much? But what will people think? How did you battle that? Was it something which you saw the Alex Hormozy offer and you said, okay, that's what we've got to do. That's the right thing to do. Or was it, especially because there's two of you as well, right? Did you have to talk about that between yourselves of, should we do this? Should we not do that?
We did. I guess that idea, like we're both engineers. And so that idea of testing and iterating. And so what's nice is, our cohorts are, they're usually 12 to 15 hours over a month, right? And so there's no business decision that we can make for the most part that is undoable. And so if we had moved the price up and no one signed up, we can offer discounts, which we didn't have to do. If we, so with each one of these, it's like, can we make the most meaningful change and then see what happens? And so that was the one where we're like, okay, like we sort of went through it's almost like the fear storming process. We're like, okay, well, if we move this, what's our worst case? And when you sort of played it out, the worst case wasn't very bad. You're like, nobody comes. Like that was our worst case. And I'm like, but that could just change it. And then it turned out the same number of people came, but they ended up being much happier. Now we could have had them come and then they could have been disappointed. So we were prepared for that. We were like, oh, well, what if it is worse? What if we've raised its expectations too much and then it comes in way short? But that, again, it's not what played out. I also think there's just part of like, we're getting better and better as we learn what works and how to tune the content, et cetera. So, but anyways, that decision didn't cause us to lose a lot of sleep. We sort of decided like we should try that. Because even our probable scenario was fewer students paying more. We can give them more attention and they'll be happier. So we're like, okay, that's a pretty good probable scenario for an experiment.
So it's with the course content itself, right? So it's come from your experience and what you've done in the corporate world. How have you adjusted that over time? Or what are some of the lessons that you feel are really helpful for people that really made a difference without giving away too much?
No, I am. One of the lessons you learn writing online, which I know you've seen as well, is you can actually give most of it away. Like people will pay for access to go deeper. People will pay to come together with like-minded people. And so I'm happy to talk about any of the content in it. I would say if I were talking to other business owners or other course creators or people trying to figure out how to run their business, there was a lesson that was pretty surprising to me. So when we first started to do the course or had the idea for the course, I wanted to test it, right? I wanted to not invest a lot of time building, a 100-page curriculum that no one wanted to partake in. And so I offered free coaching. I just said, like, I'll spend a half an hour with you working on your biggest management challenge. And in doing that, I'll get to learn. So I offered that. It's about 25 people, about 25 of them took it. 10 of them actually showed up. So that's lesson one, is like, you can actually offer more value than you have to deliver on in most cases. So of the 10 people I talked to, what was interesting is they all kept going to delegation. And in our original outline, it wasn't even a topic remotely on my radar. I was like, that's so interesting. Like, how could you even be a manager if you're not already delegating? But we sort of unpacked that, and I got behind all the fears that hold people back from delegating. I found that people thought of it as all or nothing. It was like, give away my whole job or give away nothing. There was like lots of different places they were getting hung up. And I was like, oh, I know the playbook for this. And so we added that module, and that module really is, I think, if you ask me, like, what's the magnet for the course, it is learning how to set clear expectations and then delegate work effectively. That is the thing they're all really coming for. And now we've wrapped it in more things that kind of complete the whole system, but that's like the engine. So that was probably the biggest surprise.
From the podcast perspective, I feel like delegation is one of the biggest problems I've heard consistently on this podcast, of like the guests coming on and something they've struggled with. So I guess it doesn't surprise me that that's something which would really resonate with so many entrepreneurs and like leaders as well, because it's difficult, right? It's an awkward human situation to be delegating.
It's really hard. I mean, we would always start with like, what's holding you back? Like, we do this in the course, and people will say all the same things. They'll say, like, I'm going to lose control. It won't be done as well as if I did it myself. It takes more time to delegate it, right? It takes more time in a lot of cases to explain to someone the right way to do it, make sure they do it well, than it is just to do it. But the way that I try to help people get past that is with now 25 years of data, there's this equilibrium that teams and businesses tend to find. And so you are going to pay either way. You can either make an investment up front, right? I can set clear expectations. I can go through the pain of delegating, explaining, checking, and teaching you how to do things. And that's going to cost me a certain amount of my time and money. I can skip that and hope you figure it out. You're going to bang around, cause a lot of problems. You're likely going to end up in the wrong place. We're going to have to redo work. And it turns out that the cost over here on the back end is roughly the same. The first one starts the compounding process and is an investment. The latter is an expense, and you pay it and you don't really get much of a return. And usually people are just frustrated. And so, like, once you can sort of get everyone's head around that, the willingness to sort of push through the fear, the pain, the effort on the upfront side tends to be pretty clear to them the path that they should take, but they haven't really slowed down to see that that's how it's going to play out. They're just over here in the fire drills that are happening because they didn't make the investment.
I'm laughing because I feel like I've had this exact same problem recently. We're like, but it just takes me too much time to explain to people what to do. So I'm still doing stuff which I shouldn't be doing. And you're exactly right. And it's just me deluding myself to not letting go of control. So that's the lesson I'm going to take from this, and I'll start delegating some of my things that I should have delegated a while ago.
One last thought is, so we've been doing this for a year now, and yesterday we made our first hire. So we have a person who's working with us, and so all of a sudden you go from the theory of setting expectations and delegating to the practice, and it was like this very stark reminder of like what it takes to build trust, what it is to align on not just expectations, but even just how to have a conversation about expectations, and what it takes to like put work in people's hands that's clear, but also empowering and not micromanaging. Like, I get why so many people struggle with it, because it's really hard. Like, you're trying to get two people to align on something. There's power dynamics. Like, I get why now it is like such the anchor to the course.
I think as well what's interesting is how, because you're going through the same experience yourself, it keeps you from becoming like a guru where you're just saying, oh, this is what you should do, because you have to actually deal with it yourself. And it's very easy, I think, sometimes when people give advice, if they're not still doing that themselves, to then lose sight of how difficult the emotions and everything is in that as well. And I think we talked about this before, where you said about, well, I think it's actually before we started recording, about what do you want from this business? Because you're thinking about, like, do you want to scale this? Do you want to hire people? Do you want to keep it lean? What's the end ambition? Because obviously you knew that it was going to have to take a few iterations to get something good. And now it feels like you've got to a position where things are going pretty well. But then it's like, well, what do we do from here? And what are your thoughts on that?
So I would say, like, the headline is we're still wrestling with it in a relatively balanced way, but then we had to, like, is that the fastest path to the mission, and when I think about the leverage of something like social media or our newsletter, I think, like, maybe, like, actually, that's pretty amplifying if I can, like, really focus and we can put that out in that way. There's a very different version if you go to some of the more traditional, come up with a methodology, train trainers, send them into the world. All of a sudden you can amplify that. But it's a very different business. It moves away from me connecting one-on-one, or Mara and I with a group of people, and moves much more into, you're much more of a CEO, and you have teams who go do things, and you're delegating, and you're taking on different risk, whether you bootstrap that or take funding. And so I don't think we're resolved on it. I would say right now we're on path A. But I don't know that it doesn't mean through more iteration, more hardening of the system, we couldn't then extrapolate that to path B. I see a lot of the people who chase things like B, and I'm not sure I want to make the trade-offs for, like, the totality of my happiness and fulfillment as sort of like what we found so far.
What are the things that are exciting you at the moment about what you're working on and what you're going to try and do in the future? Because I guess that's in the immediate term, I guess, rather than what's the long-term plan. But what really drives you now? What's the things that you want to do more of or try out?
One of our principles is to, like, I think it's really driven by Mar. Like, she loves the restaurants that serve 5 things, but they're all great. Like, don't take me to a diner. Take me to this cantina that only has 3 types of tacos. And that's it. Take it or leave it. This is what we do, but we do it excellently. And so we sort of hold that as a bit of our North Star, that if we're going to do anything, we want to do it really well. And so right now we're just focused on two primary things we do, right? So one is going to be these courses. And so we're going to, in that idea of testing and iterating, I think we're going to experiment with challenging some of our fundamental assumptions to see how it goes. So one of them is that leaders are so busy, they don't have a lot of time. And so they'd rather have smaller bits over an elapsed period, right? So we're doing 2 90-minute sessions a week. We've started to hear rumblings and feedback of, like, could you knock it out in 1 week? Like, could we do night school? Could we do 2 hours for 4 nights? And we certainly, execution-wise, we certainly can. So, like, can we experiment with that? We've gotten a lot of feedback from a lot of other countries that, like, we're a little pricey. And so do we somehow restructure or start to make that, some of it more asynchronous, et cetera, or do we do parity pricing? So I think we're going to experiment with, can we pull some of those levers and get more people into the course? And then the second thing, we hesitate to call it a newsletter, because when I think about a newsletter, I picture like a bulletin that, like, you kind of read, you kind of don't. So we created the management playbook. So we publish weekly on Wednesdays. And we really want it to be exactly that it's like a play. You're hungry to get it, and you're, like, ready to go run it. Like, you're going to, this is about delegating. I can go do this one thing and I will be a little bit better at delegating, or I can do this one thing and I will be a little bit better at assessing, candidates I'm trying to recruit. And so, that's probably the place that's been, like, most fun right now. Like, after writing on Twitter for a year, where everything's very character constrained and you gotta be really thoughtful about the formatting, to sort of have a more open-ended playbook to tell deeper stories and give a little more of the nuance of how to lead. So we launched that, I guess, 4 weeks ago. And it's been great. We're adding 1,000 subscribers a week right now. So, whether or not I think that's just right now, it's going to be a conversation. We don't have ads. We're not charging for the secret edition or anything like that. It's just a way for us to have a better conversation with our customers and not necessarily be beholden to decisions, Twitter or LinkedIn make about my connection to my community.
Which platform are you using for your newsletter?
We're using Beehive.
So that's what I've just switched to as well. And what were the reasons for you to use Beehive over the others?
Twofold. One, it's a little bit of a repeat of the Maven thing, which is I feel like we were stepping into Beehive right at the moment where it's proven pretty viable and it's about to take off. So we're late to being in the first group, but I think we're early to being in the next group. But the other main reason is my biggest lesson from finding my community on Twitter and LinkedIn and building this business is the power of a positive sum group. And so some of the other creators that I've gotten to know who are some are in the exact same lane, some are in adjacent lanes, some are, further afield, but we've all been able to sort of work together to, they help me grow my community. I help them grow their community, and it's that positive sum dynamic where they win and I win. And then I win and they win. And it just keeps compounding. And then instead of us fighting over a piece of the pie, we're just making the pie get bigger. And so a lot of the folks I know personally and gotten to be friends with, they were all sort of congregating over at Beehive, and we're more no, come over here. You need to be a part of this. So that was the other piece. But I think that lesson can apply. That lesson applies very broadly if people wanted to take it. Having a small tribe to travel with makes the journey a lot more fun and a lot safer.
Is there anybody in that tribe you'd like to shout out now while you've got the opportunity?
One is Jasper Pollock, who writes about project management. He and I have gotten to be very close, very, very similar journeys and just slightly adjacent communities. So even if you look at our Beehive newsletters, lots of referrals from me to him and him to me back. I'd say that was one. Austin Belsack, if you know him from LinkedIn, he started on LinkedIn and came to Twitter. I started on Twitter and went to LinkedIn. I feel like we've had a really nice mutual relationship of me helping him early on and sort of figuring out the nuances that are Twitter, him helping me early on and how is LinkedIn different? And again, very similar business models of a course, et cetera. And then I mentioned Justin earlier, but I think Justin Welsh, we've gotten to know him a bit. And there's probably no one putting forth more of the blueprint that I'm borrowing for our business. Jenny Welsh also writes, so they have sort of the same thing of two social profiles in slightly different lanes. That idea of sort of the alignment between work and life, the choices to make to value time over money, but to still have a viable business. Anyways, I feel like I'm learning a ton from him as we go. So I guess if you said shout out 3, that'd be where I start, but I could do 24 more.
Because it's always this tough thing whenever I ask people, there's a lot more than that, but we can't, it's for there's 3 people now that people listening, hopefully they can check them out if they didn't know about them already. And you've given them that little boost, which is always something nice for people who've helped you out. Really enjoyed chatting to you today. If people do want to learn more about you and the Management Accelerator, where should they go to?
Easiest way to learn about the Management Accelerator is just go to our website. So it's MGMTaccelerator.com. That'll route you right to the course page where you can read all about how it flows, dates, curriculum, exercises, etc. And then, like I said, I'm active on both LinkedIn and Twitter. On Twitter, it's D Kline II, and on LinkedIn, it's Dave Kline. So you can find me out there.
Perfect. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This was great.